everyone. I just want to make a very brief comment before I speak. And that is, for months, some of us worked in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, ensuring that the Rural Employment Guarantee Act and the money they were to get was actually given to tribals there. We never imagined that we would be fighting there, and out here, people working on this campus would be deprived of basic necessities and rights. It won't happen again, I promise you. We know how to fight in JNU also. Now, globalizing is a very broad spectrum kind of idea because we have all sorts of globalizing. I'd like to start off with one very famous discussion and mobilization of globalization called the World Social Forum. This started in the 1980s as an alternative to the World Economic Forum, which is held in Davos, where, for example, Dr. Manmohan Singh religiously goes. So, in this forum, there were lots, it's an open space. And I went there quite often, and increasingly, more and more people from outside Latin America came. You might not know that the flight from here to Brazil is about 1.5 days. So in that we discussed what is the alternative of globalization. And so we discussed new labor laws, new conditions like health, education for the children. And then we looked at more macro things. Is globalization globalization? Is wealth globalized or is it privatized? Is education globalized or is it made more elitist? Is health globalized or it is made more expensive? You would have read in the papers a few days ago that the Supreme Court ruled that for a vital medicine, the multinational corporation could not take dividends. That multinational medicine was a source for the people, and therefore it must be made cheap enough for the people. And it's not the first time it happened. Earlier, for ATZ and other anti-AIDS diseases, India made a generic drug. The manufacturer Merck, a big drug manufacturer, went to the board, that is the board of TRIPS, Trade Related Intellectual Property Rights. India held firm, said that this is a basic necessity, that of life. So what was the outcome? That hundreds of thousands of people in Africa got very cheap anti-AIDS medicine from Indian factories. But what this tells us is that on the one hand you have talk of plenty, of wealth. On the other hand, the reality is more poverty, less access to essential commodities, and a constant struggle for survival for a lot of people. In India today, there is 5% growth. Inflation is 13%. Now, a combination of low growth and high inflation is called stagflation. That's what we've got. After all these years, the learned Dr. Manmohan Singh, equally learned Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Ishar Judge Ahluwalia, and all these very great people who worked in the IMF. Dr. Manmohan Singh actually was quite radical at one time. In 1990, he issued a book called Challenge to the South. But a year later, he got another job, Finance Minister of India. So his opinions changed radically. Now, globalization, therefore, the first point I want to make, that globalization is backed by theories of development, of change, of equity, and so forth. But no study has shown these theories to be correct. Dr. Manmohan Singh has told us that those of us, people like me, we are completely out of the loop. We don't understand what liberalization means, neoliberalism means, and that's why we are backward. But it's interesting to see that what has happened to liberalized Europe, neoliberal Europe. What is its position now? Greece is in debt. Italy is almost in debt. Spain is badly off. Actually, the only country which is reasonably well off is Germany. And then, of course, there's the USA, from where our globalizers learn their mantram. Well, in the United States, there's now an Occupy movement. What is this Occupy movement? Where workers are occupying areas near Wall Street and elsewhere. So it is actually a global fight with national methods, but increasingly getting together. In the other auditorium in this building, for 3 days we had a discussion on new cultures of the left, looking at globalization. And people from Peru, from Mexico, from Argentina, Brazil, Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, all over the place came. And everyone was agreed that this path of globalization has not worked. And it's not worked because people are not working hard. People are working very hard. It's not worked because the school system doesn't talk about it, though that is a factor, but some schools do. I would suggest to you that you, every day when you look at the papers, see what they say about the world outside. I read the Hindu, which is somewhat misnamed, and almost every week there was an article about a man called Hugo Chavez. And what did Chavez do? In 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, he put in $772 billion into social programs. In a country where there was no drinking water, now there's 96% drinking water. In schools, attendance is 85%, of which 33% pass university. All education is free. They have slums, what we call slums, they call barrios. I went for a barrio meeting one day. They were very excited to have an Indian. And I found they were discussing things like, there are 2 Cuban doctors in many of these barrios. One's a dentist, one is a physician. So they were thinking, how can we get another doctor? Because we require another doctor. So this went up to the local committee. They said, well, we'll find another doctor. And so there was another doctor who was quite wealthy, but who worked free for half the day. Now this slum had paved roads. It had cable for cable TV and cable for internet. All houses had drinking water. As I said, there was a free Cuban dentist and a free Cuban physician. There was a good school. And 7 people from that barrio had been to university, and another 4 were in university. Now, no one talks of these stories. I happen to be there, so I know. So there are 2 globalizations, if you will. One globalization which is centered around finance capital, of big companies, of exploitation. And there's another globalization which is centered around the poor and the oppressed. The two globalizations are colliding, and there's going to be change. I'll just give you one statistic. In Africa now, the renminbi, that is the Chinese currency, the renminbi is taken over 40% of currency exchanges in Africa. This was unheard of because the American grip was so strong. In Africa, even India is doing major farming in Ethiopia, as is China. So the world is now in the throes of a struggle. What you saw on the screen is just a tiny slice of that. But yes, it is true that some subjects are extremely skewed. They have a tilt towards one side. One of them is economics, which I had the dubious pleasure of doing in my BA, and I've been spending the rest of my time forgetting it. So, in economics, you're taught about profit and loss, about various curves, and basically you're taught about how profits are made and profits are generated and how these profits should be brought in again into the capital cycle and so forth. And the importance to keep wages low. What was happening here was not a simple exploitation. I mean, imagine rights is a public sector unit, but it doesn't uphold rights. And JNU, of course, is very radical, but I think maybe we should have a hostel built there so that there is a constant stream of radical questioning of how people are treated. But it is a good example, and I welcome this from Lakshmi. The fact of the matter is, there are two Indias. There are two Americas. But they are not two Brazils, they are not two Bolivias, there's not two Venezuelas, they are not two Ecuadors. The first Indian, that is not our kind of Indian, but a Native American Indian, Evo Morales, is president of Bolivia. And there is a change. There is a change in that continent. You can see it, you can feel it, you can hear it. So the world is mobilizing in two directions. One is this thing of change, of empowering the people, of protecting the forests, protecting the natural resources, giving people all they require for a healthy life. That's one part of the world. There's another part of the world which is interested in making money. I'll just give you one example. There is a politician in Chennai who has the slightly peculiar name of Stalin. Because Stalin is not considered a very good chap now. When he was alive, he was a good chap because he killed everyone who didn't say yes. So Stalin, who was Karunanidhi's son, his house was raided. Why? They thought there might be an imported car for which import duty was not paid. Then suddenly one read in the papers there are quite a few cars, imported cars for which duty was not paid. Then one day, as an experiment, I watched cars pass by near Hyatt Hotel, and the amount of Jaguars, one in our own campus, I won't name from which school, BMWs, Audis, Mercedes, a number of Toyota cars, including the latest Fortuner, which is a SUV. This is there. On the other hand, you have stagflation in India. you do not have drinking water. And you have extremely intelligent politicians who know how to deal with drinking water. So Sharad Pawar's nephew, Ajit Pawar, when there was an argument that, look, we have no water, he said, what should I do? You urinate in it, maybe then you'll get water. He said this on TV. He apologized later. But no one talks about the 70,000 rupees crore scam of the irrigation scam in Maharashtra. Why? Because the press is bought. The press does not write things. I'll give you an example. Almost every day in Manipur, there is a shooting. Shooting between groups like the UNLF, PLA, and all that against the Assam Rifles, shooting amongst themselves. There was a woman, Manorama Devi, who was killed, and a most incredible story from the armed forces, from the Assam Rifles. She was wearing a fanek, this like people wear. And the army said she ran faster than them. Now I invite you to tie your bed sheet like that and run faster than someone who has two legs in trousers. Is it possible? So these instances are a sign of the resistance to globalization. I think Maushami raised a very important point through the archives, that we must collect more information, especially information which is not readily available in magazines and newspapers and so forth. We must collate this information, put it together, and use it to understand the world. Because the world is changing, no matter how much some people don't care. I mean, for example, Dr. Ahluwalia, he said last year that our growth rate will be somewhere around 8%, 8.5%. It's 5%. So why this? Because you don't want investors in India to get nervous and take their money out. I would like to bring to your notice something which is not usually brought in an IR discussion. Please look at the Indian Constitution. It is praised very highly. But the only fundamental right, only economic fundamental right in the Indian Constitution was the right to property. There's no fundamental right for women to have jobs. No fundamental right for women and men to have equal wages. No fundamental right for women to have a gender-just uniform code. Then we have another fundamental right. There is Article.
I think a denial of normativity, in a sense, does not really help the cause of good research, because very often, despite our claims that our work is not normatively loaded, I think there are a whole range of latent, implicit assumptions in the manner in which we do the social sciences. And therefore, it's sometimes good to bring these latent assumptions to the fore so that your reader, your audience knows exactly where you're coming from, what are your set of presumptions or assumptions about a particular phenomena, why have you identified particular variables, why do you treat particular variables as significant. I think all these questions need to be thrashed out at a fairly preliminary stage in your study. They can of course be refined as you go along, but it's important to sort of face up to some of these issues prior to sort of launching into a full-fledged study. I think the other important point which Maushami was gesturing to earlier was that international relations also needs to sort of take account of fresh or new archives. That there is a tendency sometimes in the discipline to exclude certain voices, a tendency sometimes to not focus sufficiently on questions which are treated as important within the other social sciences. So I think at some level the idea of interdisciplinarity also needs to take genuine sort of, some life needs to be breathed into the idea of interdisciplinarity if we are to really arrive at a more complete picture of even processes like social movements. In terms of ideas, I thought there were 2 or 3 books which I regard as fairly influential in terms of telling us what the research process actually entails. I think there is a standard textbook understanding of what a research process normally entails, but you know, in the actual rendition of the research process, you find that there are a whole bunch of false leads. There are possibilities of mistakes in terms of how we've chosen specific questions and what we've chosen to focus on. But eventually, I think good researchers tend to find their way through the maze, often sometimes making errors, but arriving at a set of issues which are then treated as important to the advancement of knowledge within a particular discipline. In terms of international relations, I think there are 2 or 3 ideas which are critical to also bear in mind while pursuing questions like social movements. There is a certain parochialism within the discipline of international relations. This parochialism has often been characterized as an Anglo-American parochialism, which is to say that international relations as a discipline has tended to be very closely linked to the fortunes of the major powers. So there has been a tendency for international relations to be treated largely as a British discipline in the 19th century and as an American discipline in the 20th century. But it's important to recognize that for us, doing international relations from this part of the world also requires us to critically revisit our maps and categories of the world. So South Asia is called South Asia in this region partly because of a certain inherited area studies tradition. But I think that's part of the problem also when we think about ways in which we conceive of politics in the region and the way in which we could conceive of even issues relating to questions like social movements. Of the 2 or 3 books which I think are fairly important and interesting, I would recommend a book called Passion, Craft and Method in Comparative Politics, co-authored by two authors, Gerardo Monk and Richard Snyder, both of whom actually do a series of interviews with scholars in the field of comparative politics. And as a consequence, I think what you get to see through these interviews are actual live accounts of what problems lead researchers to focus on a particular set of issues, what are the errors which sometimes result in sometimes false leads or lost years in terms of focusing on specific sets of questions, why it's so important to be curious about the world around you, what are the various sources you can tap on potentially in order to sort of enrich a particular study, and why it's important to step out of your discipline in order to arrive at a more richer or a different angle on a particular question which you might find interesting. The 2 other books, recent books, which I found interesting, but which also I think have a bearing at some level on research, for instance, on social movements, is actually a work called Thinking Fast and Slow by a scholar in the field of cognitive neurosciences, Daniel Kahneman, but who basically points to a whole range of heuristics and biases which inform most of our perception of reality. And I think it's important for researchers to think along these various heuristics and biases while thinking about even issues like social movements. There is also sometimes a tension between the scholar and the activist. The scholar-activist binary is one binary which you often encounter and you witness some accounts of it. And the general sense is that what Isaiah Berlin called the hedgehogs and the foxes. The hedgehogs tend to focus on the big questions, whereas the foxes tend to focus on a number of small questions. They tend to focus on detail. So I think both these elements are important in order to arrive at a comprehensive picture of politics. We need to sometimes step into the trenches in order to arrive at a deeper understanding of empirics. That empirics can sometimes help us revisit our own theories and theoretical conceptions. And it's sometimes also important to carefully flesh out a larger referential framework in which we situate particular social movements and political processes. So I think both these ideas need to go along each other if we are to arrive at a more interesting and richer understanding of the texture of politics. I think I'll stop there.
go, I would actually, because, and I would request Professor Girijesh Pant to say a few words, simply because he's just come out with a book on social movements. He's co-edited a book on social movements, and I think, you know, it would be worthwhile for him to come and give his thoughts of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas Mill. I didn't come here with the idea of addressing to you. In fact, I just wanted to be here because it's last day, and I want to thank both the colleagues who did a wonderful job in organizing this lecture series, not only in terms of coverage, but in terms of methods by which it has been presented to us. Because in a school today, there is anxiety that how do we approach the entire area studies program, international relations. You know, what should be the new methods, what kind of approach one should follow. And these, you know, lectures have given us some idea. In first instance, this idea today of looking at the material of the new kind of archives, the issues which are not being factored in our studies. All that will be, it's not only you know, lecture which you just completed as a ritual, but possibly it's the beginning of many debate in our school. And therefore I am really thankful to both of you that in addition doing a routine way of promoting it, you have also brought some new ideas, new methods, new innovation, and new way of inquiries and engagements. Well, I don't have much to say about the social movement as, but the region which I study, that's West Asia, you know, today has been very much talked about in terms of the kind of people upsurge which is going on there. And one very prelim point which I want to make here is that when things are happening, whether it's Tunisia, whether it is Square, what kind of language you describe to understand them is very important to see. Whenever I get a chance, I want to make it very clear that by describing certain episodes, or certain events, certain processes, by language you are recognizing and not recognizing it, you see. For instance, calling the entire popular upsurge, purely reducing in terms of social media, is something again a very, very partial description. You have not gone through the kind of workers' strike which is taking place in these countries, the movement which is taking place by the professionals there. All that has played a very important role when the people reach to a point called Tahrir Square. But you just reduce it in terms of a word which I very much hate is the Arab Spring. This is not the way. I mean, the moment you are using this language, the idioms, you see, you are emphasizing something which is possibly from our point of view is not the right way of understanding it. You see. Therefore, in the entire debate on social movement or any movement, or for that matter any study which you are doing, especially we in the School of Area Studies program, when we are capturing reality, it is very important for us that what kind of language and idioms we are using. These words, I am sure by this time you are aware of, these are not very innocent or naive, you think. All these are they're loaded with, you know, the very description of the region which is called Middle East is loaded. You know, so therefore the point which was raised here, the entire geography is again loaded, you see. So therefore we have to, when we are trying to understand it here, we have to be very careful about the entry point is very, very important. You see, any phenomena can be approached by any entry point. But what is the point from which you are entering will help you to raise the kind of questions which are relevant and as the entire series has brought before you. Briefly, you know, the entire movement which is taking place in West Asia, it's essentially, in my judgment, is a consequence of the what we are talking about, the globalization process there. The neoliberal economic policy, the romance with the neoliberal economic policy, has been totally demystified in this region, because both the countries, Tunisia and Egypt, was rated very high by the same IMF World Bank, which later on discovered that these are the countries which are. So therefore, when you are trying to understand these issues, when you are taking a case study of any social movement, it is very essential that you take it to the larger question, the larger theory to which you are talking of. And these movements really help us. I mean, in fact, I will like to argue that the area studies program and these episodes or these movements or these situations are very much, will help us, if we can define them in a correct perspective, to come out of the kind of a hegemony which is the entire IR theory, which we have possibly missed it, this kind of, that how the area studies experiences can help us to contest certain assumptions, certain theories. Because saying only this much, that this is a theory which has come from Western world, will be reduced into rhetoric, you see. So unless until we bring our experience from across Africa, from Latin America, from from Asia, and we try to then argue that how these theories are, talking about something which is not corresponding to the realities, that is the best way of possibly engaging what Siddharth was saying, that you bring the empirical fact and then try to bring into the theories. So I find, you see, especially I feel very fascinated, because what happening in West Asia today is basically a very beautiful example for all of us who are studying the globalization process or neoliberal economic policy, that how the informal economy can create a problem, you see. And then how the informal economy can generate a new debate, you see. I had an opportunity to be in Egypt for about 15 to 20 days back, you see. And I was in Egypt, say, 10 years back also. And you talk to people today, and when talking to people the 10 years back, you find that the total understanding of the entire social process has undergone a change, you see. And I will like to bring to your attention here that today people, though there is the media and the concern is that it is becoming Islamic society, is totally I wouldn't say that it's not the mainstream debate and not the mainstream concern, you see. Today people there are talking about, it is again, I would like to say that it is consciously, you are trying to divert attention by bringing the Islamic or these factors there, and thereby, changing the entire public anxiety or discourse, because people are really worried about, they are talking about the employment. They are talking about that what is happening to the growth which was recommended by and supported by the entire World Bank. They are not allowing the ruling government to negotiate with the World Bank and IMF loans. The Egyptian president goes for a negotiation, then there is a pressure coming from society, he delays it. So this kind of things never happened earlier. The people the ruler earlier used to go there, they very easily go and negotiate and bargain for their. So what I am trying to say that you can see today that the same society, but when the pressure is coming from the street, and when the street is not again, the moment you look at the composition of the street, you will find that people from range of segments are participating. The farmers, the peasants are there. They are happy with the entire agriculture policy of Egypt, the way the farmlands have been acquired by the retired military officers, etc., etc. The workers are happy because the wages have not gone up there. The professionals are. So therefore, what I am trying to suggest is that these movements, when you are trying to understand it, they help you certainly to find out that how the theories which we thought possibly under the so-called TINA factor, that there is no other alternative but to go for them, these things are being contested, and I think that this series has really helped us. I'm sure some of you might have taken a cue from it, that let's try to, what Kamal was saying, that try to unlearn, in the sense that, and therefore MPhil PhD is the best phase in life. All of us feel very romantic about, because that's a period when you read maximum of the book, when you read anything, everything which you feel like, when you are very indisciplined in terms of reading, that is a period. And that is a period where possibly you have this idealism also, that you can do something. And therefore that's a beautiful time, and I'm sure with the kind of faculty which we have here, the kind of student we are here, the next phase of entire our concern and anxiety will be taken care by the students and the faculty when we will find that we are really writing the kind of IR, the kind of area studies program which corresponds to the reality of what today we are calling the Global South. I'll not take much of your time, and thank you very much. And again, I would like to thank both Arjun and Mausami for anyone of you who have been involved in the process of organization know that things look very good when you are sitting in the hall, but before that, what kind of anxiety goes in your mind is and therefore for last 12 lectures, but behind that the kind of homework they have done, we all appreciate from the school. And we also would like our students to carry forward the kind of concerns raised here into their MPhil PhD dissertation, because that is the purpose of this thing, that how much you carry from here to your dissertation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pant. Well, we're not going to have any discussions. In fact, today I'm going to invite you all for tea outside, and please carry this conversation over tea and after today also. Keep this conversation going. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cow slaughter. No right about anything else? Right about cow slaughter. By the way, Nehru or Ambedkar, probably both, they tweaked it, as they say. So it was the slaughter of cows and all draft and milk cattle. It means the buffalo, the mithun, the yak, which are widely eaten in the most Hindu state of India, Himachal Pradesh. Because out here there was some yelling about beef and pork. And they must be terribly upset with the canteen. But to come to the conclusion of what I want to say, that the world is diverse, true. But economic patterns of thought, ideas of how there should be development, there is a dominant group which talks of finance capital, and the stress is on profit, the stress is on repatriating capital. There is another group which question all of these and say that the main root of discussion should be the well-being of the poor, should be the growth of many. And that is what the social movements in the globalizing world are about. But remember, globalizing is of two types. One is when you want to have globalization for people's movements, for people's benefits, for people's progress. There is another globalization, like the rights, who are interested in profit. The last point I'd like to make is, what are we going to do about it? Well, the tiny country of Cuba, under first Fidel and now Raul Castro, they have shown that there are differences. Hugo Chavez has shown that there could be differences, a different world. And Evo Morales and all the others. There are movements, even in New York, like Occupy Wall Street. But that means we will have to unlearn a lot of which we've learned. Because what we have been taught is to make us good workers for a globalizing company, one which is making profit from the sweat of others. This is something which no single coursework can teach you. But if you have this as your focus, you can do it. And in JNU for generations, we have done it. Please remember that if there is well-being of the people, and not a concentration of capital, not a concentration of wealth in a few hands, then that spread of capital to everyone will have an effect of increasing the turnover of goods, wealth, etc., so that one can then generate more capital. How does this happen? Tell you a simple Keynesian solution after Lord John Maynard Keynes. If you increase capital, you will increase the size of the market, because with that capital you will buy things in the market. If you increase the market, you will increase employment, because more people will have money to buy from the market, and some will get employment. If you increase employment, then income will go up, and then the circle, and the income goes up, the market deepens, and so forth. There is an alternative to globalization. Globalization is not an alternative. From the US through Europe, all over, we are saying that globalization is not an alternative. So next time you pick up your books, please think about that, and forget the guys who are roaming around in their big fancy cars, or the people who are saying how the economy is going through a great transition, when it is actually in stagflation, and a lot of the poor are getting poorer. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Chinoy. We'll now move on to Dr. Archana Negi. And like I said, each one has interpreted the theme very differently. And I'm sure Dr. Negi will have a different take on this whole issue of academic writings and social movements.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Basu, for this opportunity. And I feel a little handicapped to speak after the film and Professor Chinoy's very broad sweep and inspiring words. But what I need to share with you is specifically what I worked on. It's a little different from what you've heard so far. I'm not looking at globalization per se, but I'm very eager to share with you a micro study. It's a very, very small study of a particular issue, which tries to link the role that academic writing can have in the context of social movements. And I've tried to pick up one of the social movements which we've not explicitly dealt with so far, which is the environmental movement. And this is something we are all familiar with. And I've tried to link it to a particular piece of literature and the kind of impact it had and why. So, in other words, just to set off this discussion, I'd just like to point out to you that full-fledged political events like wars, revolutions, or civil wars, etc., are visible movements. These are audible movements. They bring about change amidst gunfire, amidst a lot of attention, spotlight, etc. Similarly, social movements also enjoy the advantage of visibility and audibility. If you remember the film we saw on the very first day, one of the Egyptian protesters said, when I open my mouth to speak a slogan, then I hear it echoed in the collective voice of everyone who's present there. And that's the kind of audibility, empowering audibility that social movements are related to. But perhaps in the academic setting that we are in, within a university, within an academic setting, it may be appropriate to end by celebrating the quieter harbinger of social change, that is the power of the written word, and how effectively that can be put to use to bring about social change. And this is essentially what this particular quotation there tells you, that although their role will probably always be less celebrated than wars, marches, riots, or stormy political campaigns, it is books that have at times most powerfully influenced social change in American life. Now, for the context of the discussion, I'm limiting myself to the American case study because the examples I've picked up are from there. But of course, the discussion could also be applied to other regions, etc. Let me just take you back, before I come to my main example, let me just take you back a few centuries to some of the very familiar examples of the power of the written word as far as social change is concerned. And the photograph that you see here is of Thomas Paine on the $1 bill. The reason being that it was his pamphlet, which you see scanned at the bottom, titled Common Sense, which actually brought on the American War of Independence. It very successfully could bring about that mental change which was required in order to take a stand against the British colonial masters at that time. And as this very telling quote tells you, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. This is a typical example from the 18th century of the power of the word, and which for the first time was visible in the context of American political life. A second example, and I'm sure you can guess this one because it logically flows from the first example, is that of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Some of you may have read this book at some point or the other. This was a woman writing in the 19th century. And hers was the book which infused the anti-slavery sentiment in the northern part of America and basically helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. And this is important because I also come back to the theme of the role of women in particular in bringing about social change. The impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin, of course, you're all familiar with this. It inspired the abolitionists. The abolition of slavery was something which it gave acceleration to. And of course, it also ignited a whole lot of protest and counter-literature from those who supported slavery. One interesting aspect of Harriet Beecher Stowe is the multiplier effect that you can see in the context of her writing, which is that not only did she inspire the immediate social change, which was the American Civil War, but also in terms of the impact she had on other writers who then became part of what is popularly called protest literature, etc. And just this one little quote, which is actually legendary. This is a fable, nobody has any proof of this, but Abraham Lincoln is supposed to have said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." In a sense, this quotation captures the kind of implication the written word can have to bring about this big kind of a political change. So this was an example, a typical example from the 18th century that you can see. 19th century, sorry, that you can see. Which brings me to my main case study, which is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Can I just ask for my own information from the students, how many have read this book? So that I can discuss it accordingly. Anybody familiar? All right. Okay. All right, so I'll briefly, part of my talk will be narration and part of it will be analytical, where I try to pick out from this. Now, it's a good time to revisit Silent Spring. Last year was the half-century celebration of this very great novel, and a whole lot of literature came about analyzing the impact of Silent Spring and the kind of critiques, etc., that were revisited. So what I tried to do for this particular discussion is to revisit Silent Spring, to go back to the book and to try and see what kind of academic stylistics there are which could have implications on bringing about social change. So just to give you the facts, the background, this was a book which was published in 1962. Rachel Carson was a famous scientist, marine biologist, an expert in natural history. And essentially, she documented the detrimental environmental effects of pesticides, and she is widely viewed to have brought on really the environmental movement in America in particular, but also globally as a fallout of what was happening in the United States of America. What was the book about? It was basically about the poisoning that was taking place because of the use of pesticides, essentially chemicals that had been manufactured specifically for a particular purpose or the other. And the question that she asks in the book is, what has silenced the voices of spring in countless towns in America? And this is an interesting graphic that you can see, where you see a bird trapped inside a chemical molecule or something of that sort. And this essentially captures the essence of what this book was about. The interesting things that she says basically is about the interaction between living things and their surroundings. In other words, Rachel Carson was responsible for a very, very big paradigm shift. Because before this moment, the environmental movement, so-called environmental movement, was mostly understood in the context of conservationism, right? Which is saving those animals or saving the wildlife, the pristine wildlife, etc. But it has nothing to do with us. Right? So here is man and here is nature, and man will then protect nature, which is something outside him. And she, through this book, Silent Spring, makes that essential connect, where she picks up the human being and puts him squarely within the environment and says, you are part of this whole system and look what you're doing to it. So the manner in which we view the environmental movement has to change. It can no longer be limited to this distanced viewing of what can be done, and we have to be able to understand what impact we are having on the environment around us. That was essentially the kind of thing that she was trying to do. So she describes the crusades to create this insect-free world with the use of pesticides, DDT in particular. Just an aside, in 1 second, the reason why I have a slideshow presentation was also because I wanted to share with you the paintings that you see on the side. These are paintings done by a woman naturalist called Maria Sibylla Merian. Some of you may be familiar with her work, but I've used her work as a motif. And these paintings are done 350 years ago. This was an innovation in itself. This is a woman who was deeply involved in this whole conservation thing even at that time. Now, interestingly, 1 or 2 points which come out very, very, very strongly in Silent Spring is the whole notion of people's power and the power of people to make choices. Right? So Carson is essentially saying that when we subject people to the spray of pesticides, etc., do they even know what they are being subjected to? Right? This is the big question that she's really asking. So for the first time, people's choices is something which comes into focus. And her call is that the public must decide as far as these are concerned. So she tells you in detail, those of you who read the book, which I hope some of you will after today evening's discussion, she talks about a group of chemicals. In today's jargon, we refer to them as persistent organic pollutants. But in her book, she does not use that terminology, and she essentially talks about the human-chemical interface. And she talks about the synthetic chemicals industry, how it is growing in leaps and bounds, and how all these chemicals are basically potentially poisons which are seeping into our lives every day. So the center of her story is really something we are all familiar with, which is DDT. Right? The dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, which let's just call it DDT, which is a miracle drug, which is a powerful pesticide. Many of you might know that the person who made DDT was honored with the Nobel Prize, and it was hailed as a miracle drug. He won the Nobel Prize in 1948. And this is the case with most environmental problems. Right? You take GHGs, greenhouse gases, you take chlorofluorocarbons, anything. When you create them, they are these wonderful man-made things which will be the solution to everything, but eventually we end up sitting down and negotiating conventions on how to control them, and this was the typical case. So 1939 DDT was first developed, used mainly for military use, hailed as a miracle compound, and in 1945 it came out into the open, into the civilian life. So you could find canisters in houses, in local municipalities, etc. for use, and along with it came the recognition of the potential dangers. Now Carson, when she wanted to write on the dangers of DDT, it was so contrary to the established wisdom that she actually did not find any publishers who were ready to publish her in magazine form, which is what forced her to take up this space in a full-fledged book form, and this is where she decides to tell her story, where she documents the dangers of DDT and essentially concludes that these pesticides have contaminated the entire world food supply. This is because of certain features, characteristics that these pesticides have. They tend to accumulate in human fat, they cannot be washed off easily, they don't get diluted, and they are indiscriminate. So you cannot target, DDT will not kill just the bad worms, it will end up actually killing the good worms as well. And that was the entire problem which she documents. So her most important message, to sum up, is that man today has a fateful power to alter and destroy nature, but man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. Right? So as I said in the beginning, this was the big paradigm shift as far as the environmental movement was concerned, and this is the beginning point of the environmental movement in the US. Now, interestingly, what is interesting about Silent Spring is her specific recognition of the power of social movements. Carson understands, one alternative would have been, she would have just said, let the government make more and more laws to ban pesticides. But she realized that the government could be as much of a problem as the industry itself. So she doesn't call on state action. What she calls for instead of that is a citizen's right to live. So she's not asking for a stronger government stance in intervening, she's asking for a stronger role for the common people in addressing this particular issue, and then she talks about grassroots movements, which she calls citizens' brigades, etc. So a direct connect with social movements is clearly evident in this particular book. As you can guess, and I'll skip some of these slides, the reactions to Silent Spring were very, very stark. There was widespread alarm, the industry was in shock, they were asking, should we go back to the dark ages? What do you mean by not using pesticides? And Monsanto came out with a counter literature, which tried to say that what the scenario would be if you weren't using these pesticides, right? You would have a world which would be run over by pests, etc., etc. And it also led to personal attacks. This is one of the New York Times edition which covered Carson's writing at that time. So, of course, as you can guess, 1960s, the middle of the Cold War, one of the usual critiques that Carson faced was she was communist. She wanted the Americans to not develop, and that's why she came up with this entire theory. But the more interesting aspect of the critique against Carson is the very, very gendered critique which she had to face. Now, this is very interesting even in today's context. She was written off as basically a hysterical woman. And because she was a woman, she was less rational, she was more emotional, she was more sentimental, and therefore less scientific. So let's not listen to the rubbish of this woman who basically cannot speak to us rationally. Look at the kind of language that is used. A spinster with an affinity for cats. The Secretary for Agriculture asks, why is a spinster so worried about genetics? Why is she going on about the harmful impact on future generations when she's not going to be involved? So this just kind of tells you that although women have had, I've mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, I've mentioned Rachel Carson, and although they've played a seminal role, the kind of public response that they've had shows how difficult it's been for them to actually get into this realm of bringing about social change. To move on, however, most of her work was vindicated. There were many scientists who supported her and many government reports which subsequently supported her as well. Why, on what grounds do we say that Silent Spring was this big harbinger of this movement? Well, a lot of the environmental law changes that you see in the United States resulted directly from the movements that resulted from Carson's writing. So the setting up of the Environment Protection Agency in the US, the legislations that came about, the legal principles. Right? One very important change was the shifting of the burden of proof. Right? Now the industry had to prove that such and such action was safe. This is a very, very big change as far as environment is concerned, and of course, people's awareness underwent a big change. Again, in the case of Carson, you have to consider the multiplier effect in the sense that she also then inspired many, many other environmentalists to follow. So not only her immediate fallout, but the multiplier effect as well. So we are 50 years down as far as Silent Spring is concerned. These I'll skip a bit. This is the current situation as far as the international environmental law is concerned, but come to my final part, which is when does academic writing succeed in inspiring social movements? And again, I'll draw a bit on the previous discussions we've had in the days gone by. One is this whole idea of demystification, right? Science for the public, saying something new, but presenting it to the general public in a way that is readily understandable and which will draw the reader in. This is an extremely important part, and on the day we were discussing the economic law, doing economic law as if people matter, this point was made that demystification is absolutely important. The common man needs to know what is going on as far as the World Bank, IMF, etc. is concerned. So, if you look at Common Sense, Thomas Paine, if you look at Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you look at Silent Spring, this is a common thread that you find in those particular academic writings that are able to bring about social change. A second interesting feature that you can draw out from Carson's writing is referring to the familiar to introduce the new. You know, this is 1962. People are in this whole celebratory mode as far as these pesticides are concerned. So how do you draw your attention? She draws their attention by actually referring to something which people are already convinced about, which is the negative implications of radiation. Because these were the years of nuclear testing, as you all recall. So the first page of a book actually talks about strontium-90 and talks about radiation, and then says that chemicals are in fact the parallels of radiation. So if you're already scared about radiation, you need to think about chemicals as well. This is an interesting tactic which continues to be used in a lot of writing. A third one is addressing a target audience, a particular audience, and many of the writings which analyze Carson's work point out that she very, very wisely chose to address a particular audience. And her first target audience were the housewives in the United States of America. Because she starts her analogy by saying, look at your gardens and look what's happening to the squirrels and the birds, etc. So an already receptive audience is then captured by her through this writing. And a last but very interesting tactic is the element of geography. And this is what a lot of the political geographers are basically highlighting as far as Carson's work is concerned. If you see Silent Spring, it starts with a chapter called A Fable for Tomorrow, where she describes an American town which is very healthy, environmentally doing well, etc. And then suddenly, through some mysterious change, everything changes. The birds die, the animals start dying, and ultimately the children are also silenced, etc. That's what she refers to as the Silent Spring. And then it's a small 2-page chapter, and then she says this chapter, this town, however, could be located anywhere. So what I'm trying to say, therefore, is that environmental activism normally is based on a very clear cognition of nature and space and social movements. In other words, there is this particular space that I want to protect, that I relate to, etc. And Carson, by using this tactic, does away with that geographical specificity and essentially says this could happen to anybody. Right? Which is again one of the reasons why her work resonates so much with the audience. In sum then, basically I'm making a very, very simple point. Academic writing is very, very important to bring about social change. Sometimes it brings about social change in itself. Right? By causing the state to react or take notice of it, etc. Sometimes it works through social movements. And the environmental movement has been one such movement. However, not all academic writing will normally lead you to inspire this kind of social movement. There is a particular kind of academic writing which finds this resonance, which demystifies and which draws the readers in, which ultimately leads to the kind of social movements which we've seen as far as the environmental movement is concerned. And Silent Spring is just one example. So this is the only small point that I wanted to draw your attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Negi. Well, I think it's time for all of you to actually look up the documentaries that were screened online and develop an interest in that genre, as well as pick up some books and maybe, all through this we've had references to books constantly. So I guess it's time to also familiarize yourself with that literature and maybe get in a little bit of life into one's writings. I invite next Dr. Malabarappu, who's going to tell us and discuss. We've also been contending with this theme of comparative politics. Right? We saw the indigenous movement in South Asia, and then we tried to compare it with Latin America in these few days. So the element of comparative politics is what he's chosen to focus upon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to both Maushmi and Archana for having invited me to this particular panel discussion. And Maushmi has also given us a brief that we are free to interpret the subject in the manner which we deem fit. So I think it's also an alibi for incoherence. So if I am incoherent, part of the blame is also to be attributed to this freedom to interpret it in the manner in which we deem fit. I think the important sort of idea here at one level is to sort of think about academic writings in general and how academic writings exercise a certain degree of influence in terms of even shaping material realities. If I have to come clean on where I come from theoretically, I think it's no secret that I do think that constructivism at one level does place a certain premium on the role of ideas and the influence of ideas in terms of shaping outcomes. I think Archana's presentation was a good instance of telling us something about, or demonstrating to us, how some ideas sometimes take wings, they assume a certain life in the real world, they begin to sort of motivate people to act in particular sorts of ways, they sort of generate a fire in the belly, at least for some, who are involved as direct agents of change. And to that extent, I think it's important to think about ideas and take ideas more seriously. Sometimes I think there is a general sort of perception that academic work and the academic world, in a sense, is it's some remove from the real world. It's distant from the real world. It tends to sort of cloister itself. It tends to be sometimes viewed as bookish. But I think the important point here to recognize is that ideas sometimes also take a certain time, a certain amount of time. They have a certain life cycle. And some ideas tend to exercise a greater degree of influence over other ideas. I think it's good to think about the fact that ideas itself are deeply contested. There is sometimes not much unanimity about how we can bring about social change. But fundamentally, there is an understanding that ideas could at various instances generate fairly important social and political effects. In terms of thinking about what constitutes good scholarship or what constitutes good academic work, I do think that there is no standard recipe for good academic work. There is, of course, a canonical understanding of what constitutes good academic work. Good academic work in the conventional account is sort of premised on the notion that you contribute ideas which are viewed favorably by a certain community of scholars within your chosen field. So a bunch of physicists might accord a certain degree of status to a particular idea advanced by a particular physicist. But what is interesting, if you actually look at the intellectual history of ideas and their evolution, you do find that some ideas have not received a favorable or hospitable reception at the time at which they were enunciated. But much later, these ideas were seen as fairly fundamental in reshaping or reconfiguring particular disciplines. So I think there is a certain sociology of knowledge and there is a certain politics of knowledge also in terms of how some ideas succeed during the lifetime of the enunciator of that particular idea, whereas some ideas succeed much later. It's important to give thought to these issues as well when we are thinking about the broader ecology of ideas and their influence on social and political life. I think an important element which we need to think about while thinking about academic writings and international relations in particular is to think again about the question of fieldwork. How important is actual fieldwork in terms of sharpening our sense of politics, in terms of finessing our sense of politics, and in ultimately shaping the content of what we might treat as politically worthwhile in terms of pursuing as legitimate normative goals. And in this sense, I think there is now at least a recognition that there are various methods a discipline like international relations can adopt. International relations scholars can also use ethnographic techniques and methods in order to grapple with social and political realities. They can choose a particular slice which they find relevant, but they can also do or engage in fieldwork with a certain degree of seriousness which might help contribute to a sharper sense of what constitutes politics, what constitutes change in a particular domain. In terms of broad sort of theoretical understandings within the field, there are some scholars who believe still within the discipline of international relations that there is an objective reality out there, and this objective reality is something which we need to recognize and contend with. They do believe that change is not something easy to achieve, and if change is achieved at all, it's achieved because of a certain change in power configurations. There are others who, of course, argue or believe that change is an important and integral element of history itself. There is a certain inevitability to change. So after all, at some point, the principle of racial equality came to be treated as an acceptable principle. You might have states, or you might have communities, you might have societies in which racial equality in practice is not completely or fairly implemented, but today nobody complains against the idea of racial equality in principle. So this is an advancement from a period in time in which apartheid, for instance, was treated as a norm, as a normal way of conducting relations between races. So I think it's important to think about questions of this nature when we also think about the whole issue of political change and social change within the larger sphere of international relations. One of the important pieces of counsel potentially most scholars of international relations need to sort of take on board is not to shy away from normative commitments. I think at some level we are sometimes taught that it's important to be objective, it's important for us to be at several removes away from what we are studying, because otherwise we might end up with too partisan a view of a particular subject. But I think it's also important to recognize that you need to sort of have a fairly clear sense of what you think are a set of possibilities within a particular domain. So as a social scientist, you could argue that under the following conditions, outcome X is the most favorable outcome, or outcome Y is the most favorable outcome. And I shall argue the case for X or Y